Now we enter the last part of our event today, our panel discussion with our distinguished panelists, both from online and on-site. We have Annisa Sekaringtias, a senior researcher in clean energy finance diplomacy from E3G, an independent think tank named after the third generation environmentalism. Based in London, Annisa is focusing on accelerating the global finance shifts towards renewable energy. She also investigates how energy transition could support development and resilience, particularly in low and middle income countries. Junice Yeo, she is the executive director at Eco-Business, specializes in corporate sustainability in Asia and leads the ESG intelligence division. She delivers broad briefings on evolving ESG issues in Asia and regularly mentors professionals across industries on ESG integration, disclosure, and strategy. Junice has 2 decades of private and public sector experience in China and Southeast Asia. They both will join us online. And then our third panelist, Martin, thank you for being here with me physically.
Thank you for having me.
He heads the Sustainability, Emerging and Political Risk Management team at Swiss Re Group level, which integrates ESG issues into Swiss Re's business practices and operations, acts as a catalyst for emerging risks and an analyst for political risks. Martin is a member of the FSB Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures and a board member of the UNEP Finance Initiative Principles for Sustainable Insurance. Our panelists bring in rich expertise from think tank, on-ground media, advisory, and financial institution. Following the 3 excellent keynote speech, I would love to extend the discussion in this panel with a few questions to you all and leave about 10 minutes for the Q&A. So thank you 3 for joining us, both online and on-site. We have talked a lot about energy transition, Asia, different organizations, the obstacles, and the future. And I think in our panel discussion, it will be useful to dive into the 2 main topics about transition. Where do the risks lie, and where are the opportunities? So with that, I think let's talk about the hard homework first. What are the risks? And which sectors are mainly affected by the transition risks? Given the unique position of Asia in the globalized economy, what does this mean to businesses of those sectors and financial institutions that work with those businesses? If any of you are willing to start, please feel free.
I'm happy to start. So thank you very much to the Asia Society to invite me as well. I think in particular, as we have heard from your numbers at the very beginning and also from the presenters now, Asia is probably the place in the world where those developments move the fastest. Although clearly Europe, we see a lot of traction also, and also in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, which really propelled a lot of the investments in this field. But clearly we need, when we talk about energy transition, I think we need to think also a bit broader. So it's definitely the energy sector, including utilities, the manufacturing, transport, just looking at China with the increase in e-mobility, which is nowhere as high as there, but also the production chain, which are fully integrated now in China. Before, it was rather a couple of years back, it was still Germany, or 10 years back. That was very active there. But then also the buildings, I mean, with the enormous building activities in Asia, where more and more people are moving to the cities, and not last but not least, but also the agriculture, which plays a very important role in the transition to net zero. And all of those have a huge investment gap that we still need. But I think in all of that also, besides the energy transition topics that we already covered, I think energy storage. So how can we storage on short term, which we are quite successful already, but mid-term and seasonal storage is a very important topic which needs, there's a lot of research already been done, but now this needs to be invested in, insured, and we will talk about that, I guess, later. But perhaps to my fellow panelists.
Let's not neglect our panelists online. When you feel ready. Please, Junice.
Sure, I can go first. Hi, Thank you for welcoming me as well to join the panel. Excited to be listening to this. I'm Junice from EcoBusiness. Some of the things that I think on our end that we are witnessing from an Asian perspective, I sit in Beijing, but the remit that we do for media covers the whole of Asia Pacific. There are, different types of, I would say, developments across the sectors, but the traditional sectors, agriculture, agribusinesses, I would say oil and gas, and all sorts of energy, power generation, utilities, are going through a lot of, I would say, transition momentum. And whether or not it's good or bad, I think at the moment we're still going through a difficult phase because, Southeast Asia itself is growing at a tremendous speed. I think by 2030, we're looking at a 60% increase in energy consumption from 3 years ago. So we're looking at a massive increase in the need for energy to power a middle class that's really on the move. So I think what Martin talked about, transport being a key one, is definitely going to be a game-changing way of looking at how Asia develops or Southeast Asia develops, factoring in e-mobility, the electric movement taking place, but also how do we change our food systems so that the agricultural traditional sectors are able to feed a rising population of people that is, increasingly looking at high protein consumption and obviously higher income levels as well. So just a few things, I guess, to kickstart the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Junice. I think you're exactly on the right point because Asia compared to Europe or compared to North America is still experiencing a very strong growth trend with so many different countries, from low-income countries to mid-income countries, from mid-income countries to middle-high income countries. So that trend is not neglectable. And at the same time, most of the time, our conversation would gather around fossil fuels. But as you pointed out, land use sectors, which is agriculture, so much about the food on the plate, they actually contribute to almost 1/4 to the overall greenhouse gas emissions globally. So that part is something that is probably not that obvious in Europe, as our diet and food sectors has been there for many years. But in Asia, the demand is emerging and the supply, of course, is changing along with it as well. Annisa, do you have any also contributes from the clean energy sector, especially from the decentralized and small to medium-sized part?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Isabelle, and thank you so much for the invite. I'm very happy to be here virtually. So with energy transition, I think we're talking about risk, but we're also talking about lots of opportunities that come with it. And I think, in fact, it's already happening right now. If you think about it, there is now a structural shift happening in our energy systems and how we make, model, manage energy, increasingly enabled by digitalization, but as you mentioned as well, distributed energy solutions. Perhaps how we previously see energy system traditionally as a supply side focused system dependent on centralized power plants, now increasingly include a myriad of modular, distributed, increasingly integrated solutions. And also a structural shift here is how consumers are taking more active roles as well, including as producers of energy themselves. And these changes and the political momentum surrounding them, I think, enable us a new way of thinking about energy system within energy transition that is not only about switching to a cleaner fuel, but also one that could be more equitable and center the needs of people.
Thank you very much, Annisa. Very positive thoughts as well, as the new technology might bring more green opportunities. And another observation I have in this important topic of energy transition, we see that a lot of business activities happen in Asia on ground. As a lot of multinationals or even local businesses, they start to rise, but a lot of investors still come from Europe and from North America. So what does this mean for financial companies, and what are the emerging regulatory or industry-led initiatives? What are the current trends for these companies to contribute more in energy transition? Please feel free to start. Yeah.
Yeah, so I see really the whole financial sector is really pressed by regulators also to disclose what they are doing on both the physical risk, climate risk side, but also the transition risk side. And clearly the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosure was one of the triggers, and that is not stopping in Asia. Many Asian financial sector firms have similar pressures, but it's a bit like a patchwork. So you have Singapore, you have China, you have Australia, Japan with different rules.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think also more and more pressure from investor expectations. And it's not only from Europe, but it really comes from across the world. But at the same time, you have also politicized topics when it comes to sustainability. And there you see, on the one hand, perhaps the greenwashing risk for financial institutions, and on the other side, also political risk, which are questioning where these developments are going. But overall, I see actually a big involvement of Asian financial sector firms as well. And I think it's useful to just think through the categories of both risks and opportunities in that. So the policy and legal, which I just talked about, is clearly a key area to consider. Then definitely the technology, and here for an insurance sector, we are going in a bit uncomfortable territory, because these are mostly new technologies which at the beginning don't have a long loss history. And similar for banks, also they need to get comfort. And there exactly we are talking again about the multilateral development bank and other institutions and governments, or blended finance as well, who can take first risks, which will be very important. So I believe that not only Europe and the US, but really in Asia itself, financial sectors are doing a lot and are organizing themselves quite tremendously to realize the opportunities. But the bureaucracy that we talked about is a very important one. So how you balance really soundness and then also speed on deploying both capital, but then also as an insurance company, risk transfer capacity. So as a risk absorber, but also information function where you price risk and basically tell the market in that sense where do we see risks, how can we manage them well, and how can opportunities flourish based on that.
I see. For the next question, Junice, I will direct it to you, since you are the on-ground observer in Asia of such vast land of different businesses and financial investors. How do you see these conversations put on pressure to Asian financial institutions or Asian businesses on ground? Are they motivated to do the changes, or do they lack certain type of support?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm talking about this also from a time perspective. I think I would say a good 6-7 years ago, the landscape was really different. At the time when there was very little mandatory requirements or regulatory requirements, there was a lot more of the pulling and the getting companies to understand what they have to do. But in today's context, I think regulations has been such a game changer for the Asian institutions, financial or non-financial. One of the things that has really game changed Singapore's landscape, for example, was in 2016, 2017, when the stock exchange came up with comply or explain mandatory requirements for all listed companies to disclose on their ESG requirements using international frameworks. Now, honestly, most companies didn't understand what they had to do, but they had no choice. And so with that actually came Hong Kong's, Malaysia's, Thailand, etc. All of them looking at each other's neighbors and figuring out, if the other one is reporting, I will report too. And that actually has spurred on a lot of activity. On the financial front, that has really spurred on activity for non-financial, meaning to say when financial, I would say, institutions disclose on their climate-related risks using TCFD frameworks, for example, non-financial institutions would have to do so as well as part of the Scope 3 requirements anyway. So this has been a very strong knock-on effect for a lot of carbon-intensive companies in Asia to actually get on the bandwagon simply because of investment, access to capital, access to investors, not just from Europe anymore, but from the US and from Asia Pacific right now, exactly looking for that capital. And they were willing to disclose only because they know that if I don't, I will lose out on capital as well. So that has spurred on a lot of activity, I would say, across the markets.
I see, very interesting. And among the continent of Asia, do you see there's maybe some more fast-moving countries, or maybe there's some countries with certain heavy sectors that might be lagging behind?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, an obvious market that I would say most observers would say, they're not so worried about, funnily enough, is China. And I think the reason why China is one of those that I would say they strike off their list of concerns is really because China kind of got their act together in the past decade or so, or even 2 decades. They have a large market, even though their emissions are high, but the mechanisms are in place that will take them through the next, I would say, 20, 30 years towards their 2060 net zero transition. So I think China is one of those markets that is of lesser concern relative to the Southeast Asian markets, which are much more fragmented, and more provincial and local in their challenges. Indonesia, for example, India, these are markets that are still kind of trying to get their act together on the coal issue. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that later. And the rest of Southeast Asia, including Myanmar, Laos, they have a lot of potential for renewable energy solutions, but the bureaucracy, the policy environment makes it much more challenging to really implement and see any results at the moment.
I see. So that's very interesting to see within Asia, the landscape varies widely. And this also means the opportunity lies widely as well. In the meanwhile, when we think about the transition for business and sectors, how do you also see that in terms of during the process that might affect a lot of local populations whose income depend on those traditional sectors, or whose consumption relies maybe even heavily on fossil fuel subsidies as they consume a lot of diesel for their vehicles to go to work?
Should I take that?
Please.
Oh, okay. I'll take it quickly and I'll pass it on to Annisa. I'm sure she has more to say. It is a very big problem, actually. Right now, with the transition landscape that's taking place, I think one of the biggest concerns is the loss of jobs. Of course, I think the very famous statistic is that in Southeast Asia, who could potentially lose 500,000 jobs from fossil fuel reduction could actually gain 5 million jobs at the same time from renewable energy. I think this statistic is powerful in the sense that, of course, there's an upside. You hire a lot more people in renewable, but the reality on the ground isn't as straightforward as it is. There's a lot of training involved. There's a lot of commitments, to be overseen by the governments, local governments, provincial governments. And I think just really local market situations and lack of oversight of some of these projects makes it much more challenging for the protection of livelihoods. I'm sure Annisa might have something more to say on that.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree. I think in theory, we see a lot of opportunities for jobs, but as Junice mentioned as well, that it will not come probably as straightforward as we wanted to. But I think there's also successful cases out there, and this highlights the importance of when we talk about energy transition, and especially in Asian countries where we're still expecting lots of rapid growth, the importance for the governments to integrate this plan to how they conduct their national development plans as well. And one example, probably, if I may zoom into one specific country, we could see how government very well integrate renewables and energy transition and their development plans is in Nepal. We see that Nepal witnessed an electrification rate above the global average and has done so through a lot of successful community-led models. And this has also been showing significant success in socioeconomic development, can be seen from the strength in local governance, but also increased livelihood in rural communities, again, making sure that this transition and also expanding energy access do not leave people behind. And we can see how in Nepal Development Plan, for instance, they provide quite specific details on how they're expecting distributed energy solutions. For one specific example, how this can empower education, healthcare, and generate jobs as well. So I think that intersection of integrating energy transition plans into national development plans, including also rural communities that are often left behind and most vulnerable in this, is very important.
Thank you very much, Annisa. Yes, please.
Yeah, if I just add to that, I think what is important also is really we need climate transition plans, basically, not only at entity level, at company levels, but also at country levels. As an example, in Switzerland, we had just a vote, and I think that that's good, but also even in countries like Switzerland, we don't have yet a clear goalpost how step by step we will be reaching that. And I think there are many institutions working on pieces and parts of that, but that needs to happen, and it needs to include the social agenda and labor markets. I think if we can solve the labor market issue, then we have solved a big part of it. And as said, Junice and Annisa, net there is many studies that there is a positive effect, but it's the question of timing. So if we can really start that very strongly, that will be very important. And before, one of the mechanisms was mentioned with the just energy transition partnerships and programs, where basically you incentivize the decommissioning of certain fossil fuel plants early on by in turn giving loans and investments and risk transfer capacity to accelerate renewable build-out. And at the same time, I think you need really to have reskilling programs. But for example, in the oil and gas sector, these skills, again, can be used also for, as an example, carbon removal, where you need drilling capability, you need a lot of engineering capability, which is used in those classical sectors. But here we need to think a bit outside the box as well, how we really use labor in different ways and how we can do that over time. So that's a very, very important topic, in particular in Asia, as you said as well.
I think this goes exactly into what Christoph was saying about MDB's role, that they provide not only financing, because also not only financing is needed, we need actually a very detailed plan to transition into a new status of a low carbon economy. And along this trajectory, it's not only about the number of money that is needed in different countries or sectors, but it's also about what type of technology can be deployed, in which location, and what type of population is possible to be put on a new path of employment, and what type of organizations who can potentially shoulder this type of responsibilities. I think we now have around 12 minutes. I saw many hands raising during the earlier time of this event. I would give this time to our participants here. Please don't feel shy. Please. Nico, there. You can address the question to any of the panelists or even to our keynote speakers.
Great, well, I'll just address it to everyone then who spoke. So thank you for this. I have two questions. The first question I have is on the role of the private sector when it comes to the energy transition. Now, and we talked a bit about that towards the end. How can we empower the private sector, especially multinationals, with their supply chains across countries and who are in and of themselves huge consumers of energy, to be able to transition and therefore have a large impact? Now, is it through more regulation? As Junice, you talked about ESG reporting, you talked about the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Does it lie in that direction? My second question is this: the energy transition is a complex beast. Asia is hugely complex, but we have limited time and limited resources. What would you say is perhaps the most, or one of the most effective levers that we could pull so that we can get to where we need to with the limited time that we have? Would it be through maybe redirecting subsidies? Is it through, for instance, blended finance, mechanisms? What should we be looking at?
That's a great question. So which carrot and which stick do we pick? Please feel free to pick either carrot or stick.
I can take the stab at it. But
okay, Junice, go ahead.
All right, sure. No, I think they're great questions. On the multinational front, actually, it is a big conundrum because they are subject to a lot of regulations themselves, depending on which jurisdictions they are. In my view, when we talk about multinational companies in Asia, very often they are American or European based. But I think we should also look at very large conglomerates in Asia who have the capabilities and potential to really influence private sector and public sector policy making kind of directions. Where I actually feel that it could really be interesting is on the carbon pricing front. Carbon pricing is still relatively new, or rather the carbon markets themselves are quite new in Asia Pacific at the moment. But that said, there's a lot of interest from a pricing perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective. Oh, did I get kicked out?
No, you're still here.
Okay.
You're still here with us.
All right. Okay. No worries. And I think with carbon pricing actually being priced into emissions at the moment, and meanwhile having more regulations forcing companies to disclose on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, we are kind of cornering companies into the space where they have no choice but to manage their emissions and bring it down. So they have no choice then but to invest in new technologies, new innovations, find a way around carbon capture storage, find a way around hydrogen, co-invest, collaborate, work with public sector, innovations to really try to crack the code on bringing down the pricing of emissions and new technologies that would come with it. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Junice.
Perhaps to add to that, or to the multinationals, and very, very good point, Junice. I think really the huge conglomerates in Asia, but also who are expanding in other parts of the world. I think what is needed there is really some quick actions which are not done, which are already today not only feasible, but they are very profitable. So, for example, on scope 2, there's no reason why big companies don't source their electricity in a green way, and there are many ways to do that, not least power purchasing agreement or green tariffs, and this is something which really every company can do, and actually with the price that we have, this is very cost efficient as well. Also on scope 1, many companies can still do a lot on energy efficiency measures across those sectors that we discussed. I think the tricky part is really scope 3, how you work on that, and I think here the upstream supply chain is a key lever where clearly companies can ask or collaborate, co-innovate with their suppliers on that topic. And downstream, clearly, which is for the financial sector a huge topic, but also for the producing industry on products, there many initiatives are undergoing. So I think, for example, in mobility, the marine industry is really talking about completely new ships and new motors and new fuels. But clearly, this isn't. That goes back to the investment horizon. So we need to be quick in taking the right decisions, because if you lock in on certain technologies, they will run for 20, 30, 40, sometimes even 50 years. So I think that's a key, but I think I'm quite optimistic if companies really work across the value chain, because some sectors will have really difficulties to transition themselves. They need the demand signals of companies who really say, at the beginning, over this initial investment hump, we pay a little bit more. At the end, it should be not more expensive. Long term, definitely comparable or even lower in costs.
Yes.
And I think biggest leverage is to your point is really governments need to do their work as well. So, and I think the NDCs as they exist, they just don't go far enough. I think that's quite clear, but on this blended finance concept that we discussed briefly, I think that's a key item. The collaboration with the MDBs, they're really unlocking the financing, but a pledge for insurance as well. There's a really risk transfer from the insurance sector is also important, but the right price. So everybody wants to go into those transition technologies, but they come at higher risks than traditional risks, and I think the market needs to be prepared to pay also for the adequate risk levels there.
Great. And small comment from my side. I mean, I think all of our panelists offers fantastic views from their expertise. Also coming back to the question here, when we talk about carbon pricing across globe, when you think about carbon pricing, you literally put a price on per ton of CO2, which is mobile. It doesn't matter if you emit it from Switzerland or from Indonesia. It's floating around the world. And why should these prices be different? I mean, for instance, in the current future scenario analysis, we say that under the 1.5 degree scenarios, per ton of CO2 should be priced around $200 US. At the moment, what are the price levels? Maybe in Europe, around 80 or 100 euros. But in China, which is I would say, the longest standing carbon market in Asia, the price is probably around 10, 15 francs. So how are we going to get there to have to start from a fragmented landscape to go to a very well coordinated plan, which is also exactly the point about the scope 3 emissions, where multinationals or financial institutions that have branches or operations in different countries, do they get the same kick at each node of their business? That's the key question. We still have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
You just mentioned carbon pricing, and also ESG came up as a mechanisms to direct these energy transitions in Asia, probably also worldwide, of course. On the other hand, when I think of Asia, I think of mega cities, where there's a lot of economic dynamics, but we also have a huge waste and garbage problem in these countries. We have huge landfills, and from my perspective, incinerators are actually a very good instrument to take care of the waste problem, of the plastic problem, waste ending up in the rivers, and it's an energy source. And with CO2 pricing and ESG, it's no way you can finance these incinerators. Singapore has taken care of this problem because it's a small place. They don't have no place for landfills. But I think incinerators have an important role in this energy transition that is almost never discussed. It provides baseload energy that you can produce at night when you don't have, or on a rainy day when you don't have wind and when you don't have solar energy. So I think I would like really to see much more emphasis on state-of-the-art incinerators to clean up a lot of the other environmental issues that come along with these mega cities. What's the view of the panel here? Are there really mechanisms to develop that? I think in Beijing they had to start also building incinerators because their landfills were just running out of problems. Maybe Ms. Yeo can give us an insight here.
Sorry, I just wanted to collect a bunch of questions, so I let the panelists decide whichever question you feel more comfortable to answer. I think we had another question from that gentleman. Madeleine, yeah.
As climate is a global phenomenon, there has to be a global approach to solving the issues. You're making a very important point on an inefficient market scenario where European carbon emission prices are at 80 and the ones in China are at 10. But that is an indicator also of the global tensions that we have. There was a very important, early on, a very important remark that we should look at per capita rather than country statistics. If you look at per capita, you see that the Western world emits a very high percentage on a per capita basis relative to the per capita in Asia. And that has to do with the fairness issue, and that brings up the question of global tensions, that brings up the question, Junice, you are in Beijing with the Singapore skyline behind you, but how do you look at the capability of coming to a global mechanism that really works? Bringing China and the US into one boat, and also the ASEAN countries.
Just to add in your question, you mentioned defense, but there's also, for instance, the trade topic in terms of per capita emission. Most of the emissions at the moment are production territory based, which means you calculate the emission based on whatever is produced in this land, while you don't really calculate or disclose even further how much do you actually consume per capita. A coal miner might have a very tiny house that doesn't even have electricity. So that is, I would say, the clash also of different realities of lives on Earth. I let my panelists pick whichever question you feel more comfortable to answer, and if you feel happy to answer both, I don't stop you.
Just very quick answer to both. I think we need more system thinking as well. So it's I think it's right. It needs to be solved on a global level to a certain extent. And to your earlier question, I think, or it was a question back there as well on the regulation. I don't think we need more regulation, but we need well-coordinated regulation, or as it's often called, interoperability, which is super important. But also we should not shy away to take local actions. And I think we need, as we heard from the three presenters before, time is running out. So we need really, even if it's smaller actions in the right direction, that's good, while developing at the same time a broader view. And I think on the incinerator question, I would say that's just one of many solutions, but totally agree, we can't just have landfills, and it has the very good side effect that you have thermal heat, which you can use to heat houses in at least moderate or northern or very south climates.
Just to add on to Martin's point, maybe I'll start with the incineration question first. It's a really interesting perspective there. And in fact, I think when I researched Beijing's incineration rate, it was about 35%. That was about 3 years ago. I assume it's gone up simply because the consumption and the waste issue is growing. But I think the problem here is China is so big, right? And if they were to invest in waste incineration, being a country that considers common prosperity, then you'd have to consider investing in it for many other cities as well around the world that has a similar, around China that has similar problems too, or similar traits. Singapore, the problem right now is that people are over-consuming. The waste capacity is so high that actually the ash field that they are putting the incineration ash into is filling up and will fill up in 10 years' time. So the problem with Singapore right now is they don't have another ash landfill that they can bury their waste in. That's another set of problems. And this is also why the government is thinking, how can we influence consumer behavior and also the extended producer responsibility when it comes to waste issues, simply because you can't keep throwing trash away and assume you can burn it up and heat homes for perpetuity. Then I think the other question on China and the US, I think it's a very difficult one. Honestly, geopolitically, they're irreconcilable at this stage. It's very daunting because I think China is trying really hard on the sustainable development space. They are trying, they've stopped, coal investments overseas, for example, and these things are announced at the highest levels. So we should not take that lightly. But I think the moment it gets jeopardized by US, I would say Western politics, a lot of it becomes a setback, because whenever you go into COP or you go into any of these climate negotiations, you have Saudi Arabia, you have China, you have many markets actually kind of just going at each other, and it's not making any progress there. So I think geopolitically, it's making it extremely difficult to make any progress.
Thank you, Junice.
Yeah, just to add very quickly, a lot has been spoken, and I very much agree as well. We need to increasingly think in system and perhaps the demand side of it. Easy consumer behavior is also what's important. And relating back to the previous question about levers as well, I think it's almost the beauty of it, because there's a lot of different levers that might apply better in one country but not the others. And coming back to the question about the geopolitical condition, I think currently, as we're heading towards COP28 now, we can demand more of concrete multilateralism from or concrete output from these international diplomatic venues. Especially there's now, like for this year, there's an increasing call for global renewables target and also global efficiency targets. Obviously, there's also previous pledges that haven't been delivered yet, and it's important to make those venues not only like once a year disjointed efforts, but we need to make sure that it's accountable, and also for like private companies that making pledges all around the margin of those venues. We need to make sure that we keep them accountable. A lot of data and lots of transparency that need to be put out there.
Thank you, Annisa, very much. As our insightful discussion draws to a close, we are already a little bit over the time. I want to thank our distinguished panelists and also our keynote speakers and every one of you who came here to join us at the event. Let's carry the spirit and the conversation forward, and let's give a round of applause to all of our keynote speakers and panelists. And heartfelt thanks to Asia Society and Swiss Re for organizing such an amazing topic. And we will have a standing lunch outside. And thanks very much to Annisa and Junice for joining us far away. And we hope to carry the conversation along. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.